Above the shattered streets of Warsaw, the world is a roaring inferno of falling masonry and relentless machine gun fire. But beneath the cobblestones, in the labyrinthine darkness of the city's sewer system, a different kind of war is being waged. Here, the air is thick with the suffocating stench of waste and the cold, damp breath of the underground. There are no maps for this sunless world, only the sound of rushing water and the rhythmic, hollow echoes of boots splashing through the filth. The occupying forces above call this a victory, yet they are terrified of the shadows beneath their feet. They know that somewhere in this stinking maze, an invisible army is moving in total silence, preparing to strike from the iron grates. This is the terrifying, visceral reality of the brutal war hidden beneath city streets. The true battle for survival often takes place where sunlight cannot reach. If you are captivated by these untold stories of human resilience and the dark, hidden corners of history, you must subscribe to our channel right now. Join our community of historians and thrill seekers by hitting the like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. By August 1944, Warsaw was a skeleton of a city. Above ground, the German army had turned the Polish capital into a firing range, methodically reducing every building to rubble. But for the Polish Home Army, the end of the streets was only the beginning of the battlefield. Realizing that moving through the ruins was a death sentence, they descended into the only place the tanks couldn't follow, the city's vast, intricate sewer network. Entering the sewers was like stepping into a cold, liquid tomb. The men and women of the resistance had to move in absolute darkness, often wading waist-deep through toxic, freezing filth. There were no lights, and the air was so thin, it felt like breathing through wet wool. Every few hundred meters, they would pass beneath a heavy iron manhole cover.
Das ist ein Albtraum. Sie entkommen uns immer wieder durch die Kanalisation.
Reicht jetzt, Major. Wir tun, was wir können. Die Pläne sind nutzlos.
Through the tiny slits in the metal, the terrifying sounds of the war above, the rumble of tiger tanks, and the rhythmic crackle of flamethrowers echoed down into the tunnels. In the pitch black, the only way to navigate was by touching the slime-covered walls and whispering passwords to shadows that might be friends or executioners. They were a subterranean army, invisible, terrified, and utterly determined. The struggle for light had ended. The German high command, frustrated by an enemy they could not see, quickly realized that the city's drainage system had become a tactical nightmare. To the occupying forces, this subterranean war was a chaotic violation of traditional military order. They could not send their heavy tiger tanks or armored divisions into the narrow, slime-slicked pipes, so they resorted to a more calculated, mechanical form of cruelty. They began to turn the sewers into a series of elaborate, lethal traps. Special acoustic teams were stationed at every major manhole, pressing their ears against the cold, vibrating iron to catch the faint, rhythmic splash of a human footstep echoing from the deep. When a sound was detected, the response was immediate and merciless. They didn't engage in a fair fight. They simply dropped heavy grenades into the darkness, followed by canisters of choking poison gas that hugged the surface of the black water, creeping toward the lungs of anyone hiding in the curves of the brickwork. Inside the tunnels, the atmosphere shifted from mere filth to a literal chamber of horrors. The resistance fighters, many of them barely out of their teens, found themselves trapped in a three-dimensional nightmare where the walls themselves seemed to be closing in. They moved in human chains, each person clutching the belt or the shoulder of the person in front, blinded by the total absence of light. The The psychological toll of this lightless environment was devastating. Men who had survived months of brutal urban combat suddenly broke down in the dark, overwhelmed by the suffocating claustrophobia and the terrifying realization that they were wading through the waste of the very city they were struggling to liberate. Every manhole cover above became a potential execution point. They could see tiny, mocking slivers of daylight through the grates so close they could almost feel the warmth, but to reach for that light was to invite a summary execution. The Germans began stringing jagged barbed wire just beneath the water's surface, unseen traps designed to snag skin and fabric, pinning the exhausted soldiers in place while the gas did its slow, silent work. This was a desperate, wet crawl through the bowels of a dying capital, where the earth above felt like a heavy, suffocating hand upon their shoulders. The smell was the first thing that broke them. It wasn't just the sewage. It was the stagnant, thick scent of old death and the metallic tang of fear. By the third week of the uprising, the tunnels had become the only veins left in a dying city. The resistance couriers, many of them young women who knew every curve of the brickwork, became the literal lifeblood of the movement. They moved through the darkness with a haunting, feline grace, guiding columns of exhausted soldiers and terrified civilians through the freezing muck. But as the German grip tightened, the tunnels began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a massive, pressurized trap. The silent marches were the most agonizing. Imagine a column of 200 people, shoulder to shoulder, in a pipe barely 5 feet high. No one was allowed to speak. No one was allowed to cough. If a wounded soldier groaned, a hand was clamped over his mouth until he went silent.
Such den Bereich ab. Ich habe hier etwas gehört. Beeilung.
The only sound was the heavy, wet slosh of boots and the frantic, rhythmic thumping of hearts against ribs. They moved by touch, a human chain of desperation where the slightest slip meant being swept away by the dark current into an unreachable abyss. The darkness was so absolute that men began to hallucinate, seeing flickering lights or the faces of loved ones in the swirling, toxic water. Then, the sound came. A sharp, mechanical clink from a manhole 50 feet ahead. The column froze. Above, the German sewer police had lowered a microphone. The resistance fighters held their breath, their lungs burning with the need for oxygen, as they listened to the muffled, distorted voices of the hunters above. The tension was a physical weight, heavier than the tons of debris overhead. Suddenly, a heavy object hissed through the air and splashed into the water. "Grenade!" someone hissed, though it was barely a breath. The explosion in the confined space was devastating. The shockwave traveled through the water like a hammer, slamming into chests and rupturing eardrums. In the chaos that followed, the water turned from black to a dark, thick crimson. There was no room to run, nowhere to hide. Those who survived the blast had to climb over the fallen, their fingers slipping on wet brick as the hiss of poison gas began to fill the tunnel. They were being hunted in the bowels of their own home, and the exit was still a mile of darkness away. The freezing water offered no mercy to the living or dead. The survivors of the blast scrambled through the rising tide of filth, their ears ringing and their lungs screaming for air that wasn't poisoned. Every manhole above was a potential trap. The German forces had turned the urban infrastructure into a giant execution chamber. They dropped burning flares to illuminate the movement below and followed with targeted bursts of fire. The resistance fighters were being hunted in the pipes, yet they pushed forward. They carried the wounded on their backs, their fingers digging into the slime-covered brickwork. It was a war of centimeters. To move 10 meters took an hour of agonizing silence. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a physical weight pressing against their eyes. They began to lose track of who was still behind them in the human chain. When they finally reached a designated exit, the iron ladder was slick with cold condensation. Emerging into the ruins of Warsaw wasn't a relief. It was a transition from one hell to another. The city above was a forest of blackened chimneys and constant sniper fire. They stood in the gray twilight, their skin stained black by the city's waste, looking like shadows birthed from the very earth. They had escaped the gas, but they were now exposed targets in a wasteland of pulverized rubble. There was no victory here, only the grim, silent continuation of a struggle that had moved from the sewers back into the ruins of the broken, burning capital. The final days of the Warsaw Uprising were not marked by a grand, cinematic finale. They were defined by the slow, agonizing dissolution of the human spirit within the freezing pipes. As the German military began to systematically blow up the sewer junctions with heavy demolition charges, the subterranean world became a chaotic labyrinth of collapsing brickwork and rising toxic tides. The evacuation of thousands of resistance fighters and civilians through the vessels of the city turned into a desperate, uncoordinated scramble for life. The human chain, which had been the only thing keeping them sane in the absolute darkness, finally began to snap under the weight of sheer animal terror. People were lost in the side tunnels, their frantic cries for help echoing off the slime-covered walls until they were silenced by the rising water or the creeping heavy clouds of poison gas. Inside one particularly narrow passage, a small group of survivors huddled together, their bodies shaking with uncontrollable tremors from extreme hypothermia. They had been underground for over 48 hours without a single ray of sunlight or a breath of clean air. Their skin had turned a sickly, translucent gray, and their eyes were wide with the permanent stare of those who had seen too much of the abyss. Above them, the city was being methodically erased, block by block, but the sound that terrified them most was the rhythmic, metallic tink, tink, tink of German engineers tapping on the pipes to locate their positions. It was a cold, calculated hunt, a game of cat and mouse played out in the bowels of a dying capital. When they finally reached a designated exit near the city center, the iron ladder was missing, blown away by a previous explosion. They stood waist-deep in the black swirling filth, staring up at a small, circular patch of gray sky that seemed a million miles away. To climb out was to face the immediate, lethal fire of a machine gun nest positioned exactly over the grate. To stay was to drown in the dark as the Germans began to pump thousands of gallons of gasoline into the system. In that suffocating silence, the survivors looked at each other one last time. There were no heroes here, only tired, broken people who had been pushed beyond every human limit. They reached for the jagged edges of the brickwork, their fingers bleeding and raw, preparing for one final desperate ascent into the fire. The tragedy of the Warsaw sewers is not a story of a glorious victory, but a chilling testament to the terrifying lengths of human endurance under the most inhumane conditions imaginable. For 63 days, an entire city fought to breathe while being systematically crushed from above and poisoned from below. The subterranean war stripped away the last vestiges of traditional military honor, replaced by a visceral, primitive struggle for survival in a labyrinth of filth and absolute darkness. When the uprising finally collapsed, the capital was little more than a vast, smoldering field of broken brick, and silent chimneys. The Germans had won the surface, but they had been psychologically scarred by an invisible army that haunted the pipes beneath their feet. Today, the modern streets of Warsaw have been rebuilt over those same ancient tunnels, but the echoes of the silent marches remain trapped in the cold, damp brickwork. This chapter of history serves as a haunting reminder that even when a city is erased from the map, the spirit of its people can retreat into the shadows and refuse to die. It is a story of profound loss, where the line between the living and the dead was as thin as a manhole cover. The survivors emerged into a world they no longer recognized, carrying the thick, suffocating darkness of the sewers forever.